Hello all. This is The Wandering Eye. It's been a while since I posted a video because I've been kind of ruminating on the subject of America as an empire and what the South has to say about that in our current moment. Obviously, there's a lot that can be said from the Southern perspective about how we got to be an empire, how long we've been an empire. But in this current moment, and especially in light of several recent developments with Greenland and the desire and the seemingly broad desire on the American right to essentially annex and officially possess and control Greenland, and with the open exercise of American military power in Venezuela for the deposition of a hostile foreign head of state within our perceived sphere of influence. And then there's also the Epstein files. Uh, I feel like in the last year, and probably in the last few years, even under Biden, American conservatives have come to understand that we are very much in an empire, that we are very much part of an empire. Prior to that, I think that even though obviously, I as a Southerner believe that America has been an empire since 1865, since the Northern victory in the Civil War, I believe that the South was, as I often say, America's first exercise in nation building. That's what the Reconstruction period was. It was the effort to remake the South in the image of the North, essentially. Um, but we've conceived of ourselves as citizens of a republic for a very long time, when it hasn't been the case. Uh, we've not only been an empire since 1865, we've been the chief empire in the world since 1945. And we're the actually most relatively dominant imperial power in our time. Uh, we're more dominant in our time than any other empire ever was in its golden age. We are, or have been until quite recently, the undisputed economic center of the world, the unchallenged military leader in the world, the cultural source of modernity, the seedbed of innovation, and all these other things. We are now coming to see, especially with regard to the disclosures in the Epstein files, in quite stark colors, that not only are we an empire, we are a very late stage empire. The talk of golden age is gone and gone for good, I think. Uh, we are a late stage empire. We are very nearly in our death throes because the legitimating principles of our government and of essentially all Western governments have been undermined beyond repair. By which I mean, uh, Western governments have, for a minimum of 80 years, and in our case, for the entirety of our national history, operated on the premise of the consent of the governed, have instituted their governments with legitimating principles that amount to: we are the guardians of liberty, we are the advocates of liberty, the torchbearers of freedom and liberty in our areas of influence, in our domestic politics, in the broader global order. We are the guardians of this notion of uh, individual rights, this liberal world concept. And by which I mean fundamentally liberal, not just liberal in the modern context. Um, that has long been the idea that has lent our government its legitimacy. And I think in light of the disclosures in the Epstein files, what was previously the understood situation in the eyes of the American right is now the undeniable reality, even to relatively disinterested observers of politics. When one is approached with the notion that we are a sovereign nation with a government which governs for the good of and by the consent of its people, This is merely farcical at this point. We are a late stage empire run by a network or many networks of influential people who engage in very degenerate behaviors, uh, and who wantonly and regularly transgress and disregard the supposed checks and safeguards that have nominally been placed upon them. They operate outside of national borders. Uh, they collude across cultural and civilizational lines, even. I mean, the amount of interaction between significant figures in the Middle East, in the Western aligned Middle East, and in Europe and the United States, Japan, etc. It's west wide. It's not just the United States, but the United States is not the extent of its empire. The American empire controls a very vast swath of the globe, including essentially all of our military allies and those who are under our immediate protection. If there is a military base in your country, you are to some extent part of the American empire. And uh, in this context, what role does the South have? So, in previous eras of American history, various regions of the continental United States have served as kind of the chief engine of the American empire. Uh, Following the Civil War, you would get really the North, New England, was leading the show, was the chief source of the ideas, of the uh, affluence, etc., the culture in America. Later, you get the rise of Chicago. In the early 20th century, in the mid 20th century, even, it was more the Great Lakes region, and then thereafter the Pacific coast. The South was the foremost region in the United States during our Republican period, from the founding era until 1860, essentially. This is, if a European knew of an American, it was likely a Southern author, a Southern statesman, with the exception of Benjamin Franklin. Nearly all of the most famous Americans prior to the Civil War were Southerners. And this was the source of American culture. But since we've been an empire, the South has never acted as the chief engine of the empire. And I think that this is largely because the advocates of the American empire have not perceived that the South could be trusted. The South has more than any other part of the country retained an identity as Republican, by which I mean small r, advocates of Republican government, uh, individual responsibility, local control, small government, that think Roman Republic. But now there's a risk of Southern conservatives and all American conservatives more broadly becoming okay with being an empire, becoming more comfortable with that identity. And I think it was inevitably going to happen to some extent, but it doesn't mean we cannot engage in some introspection and be circumspect in going into these waters on an individual basis. I do believe that the South has been chosen to be the new engine of the empire because the other regions of the empire have been so thoroughly hollowed out. We see, for instance, the prospect of a new uh, stock exchange opening in Texas. We see massive relocation of individuals, of opportunities, of industry from other parts of the country, especially from the Pacific coast, which has been the recent engine of the empire, to states like Florida and Texas and Tennessee. And with this, we see an increase in the number of problems that have found themselves on the South's doorstep, demographically, with regard to exposure to uh, disproportionate amounts of foreigners, foreign influence, greater degrees of corruption, things like this, and just an incredible amount of external investment in almost every southern state, almost every major and mid-sized city in the South, is having a boom right now. And the reason we're having a boom right now is because we are the most culturally vital region of the United States, the most culturally distinct region of the United States at the moment, because every prior region that was once the engine of the empire was hollowed out by so being. And if we just allow the good times to come while they may and adopt this kind of jingoistic enthusiasm for empire while we get to sit in the driver's seat, so to speak, uh, the South will meet the same fate. The South will be hollowed out. It will lose its distinct nature as a unique region of the United States with a particular history. And that particular history has long been Republican, even when the country was broadly more comfortable with empire. Um, so then one must ask oneself, okay, we live in an era of empire. We can't really take a step back from our position of global dominance and say, we're going to be isolationists now. We're going to be disinterested in world affairs. We're going to focus on ourselves essentially and do what's best for our people domestically and not hold power and exercise our muscle on the world stage in the way that we have. If we do so, we will ultimately find ourselves at the mercy of China and other rising powers like Turkey, even because we've outsourced so many of our vital functions with regard to industry, et cetera, that we really cannot achieve autarky. We cannot achieve resource self-sufficiency in the way that we might have been able to if we made better decisions earlier in our history. So we can't just return to the isolationism of earlier American history. We are an empire, and we must play the hand that has been dealt to us in that regard. But I believe that there's great good that can come of Southerners in particular still conceiving of ourselves and conducting ourselves as citizens of a republic instead of as subjects of an empire. By this I mean, I conceive that one of the chief characteristics of an empire is essentially made manifest in a welfare state. The idea of a Republican citizen as opposed to an imperial subject is that a Republican citizen believes that their duties, that they owe particular things, that they possess particular duties toward their polity, toward the republic. The subject of an empire merely exists in a situation where they are presented the prospect of great gain of wealth, of influence, of what have you, the spoils of being part of an empire, and they see it as an endless well to be drawn from, an endless source of comfort, of affluence, etc. And they see themselves as the possessors of a particular right to withdraw from this stock, this common stock of the empire. Um, in essence, republics consist of individuals, of of persons, of relationships. Republics operate at the local level. Empires consist of systems. They're faceless. They are void of personality. They are operating on a macro scale to so great a degree that they simply cannot be personal. They cannot be individual in their interactions. And this distinction uh, is a lot of why this Epstein situation is the crisis that it is for the West, is because most people live on a scale, they live in a way where they don't have individual relationships with their neighbors. They don't exist in small local networks. They rely upon institutions. They rely upon Social Security. They rely upon federal protections in this area or that area of their lives. They rely upon insurance. All of these things are systematized. Uh, Food stamps, etc., disability, whatever it may be. They don't rely on local networks. They don't have individual relationships with people who actually facilitate their day-to-day life, and they certainly are not capable of sustaining themselves in a direct way in their day-to-day life. Even if they do have a well-paying job, they don't actually create or sustain uh, or really have much at all to do with the provision of the actual necessaries of their physical existence. In a republic, generally one would provide much of what one needs, what one's family needs, in an immediate way uh, themselves. They would not rely on external systems to provide it for them in any way, uh, or to convert, labor in one context into the necessaries of life. And I believe that, uh, since we are now in this moment of crisis where the Western foundations, the pillars of Western governments, have been delegitimized by the ousting of the reality of the way in which our nations operate, which is through international influence networks of vicious elites, essentially. By vicious, I mean non-virtuous, who do not have the particular interests of their particular peoples in mind. Uh, since that is the way in which the American empire operates on on an international level, because we are a global empire. I think that a lot of, especially American conservatives, are asking themselves, okay, what now? What is the move to make now? What can we actually do in order to capitalize on some of the leverage that we do possess, those of us who are opponents of this imperial project, in that there is a weakness to the establishments in the West right now. They are vulnerable. They are certainly not prepared for a lot of the things that the internet has facilitated with regard to dissent, with regard to action, contrary to their ends and their aims, contrary to their basic power. But what can we actually do individually to really consolidate any gains which we might make uh, while the forces of empire are weak, while the uh, self-interested and vicious ruling class across the West has something less than a total grip on power? Well, what we can do is we can conduct ourselves in a Republican fashion and not as imperial subjects. We can network locally. We can strive to provide more of the necessaries of our own day-to-day lives. We can endeavor to get in positions which allow us some degree of control over real resources, uh, food, water, etc. And essentially create legitimate societies on a local level, maybe on a county level, maybe on a multi-county level, uh, in a very rare instance, maybe even to the level of an American state, although I am skeptical that there can be any trust at that scale. But essentially create societies within the broader context which operate on networks of people who we know personally or who we are connected to on a familial basis, who are more proximate to ourselves in values, in actual geographical space, and essentially just function with the greatest degree of independence from the imperial framework that we can. And the virtue in this proposition is that we are a late stage empire. We're not a growing empire. We are not in a golden age. We are a dying empire. And that empire will die very probably within my lifetime. Therefore, the successor states, the states, the political entities which will rise up in the wake of the death of that empire, uh, they're being made right now. They will be the the wellsprings of their power, their uh, bases of power, will be local networks of real people with real skills who control real resources and can sustain some quality of life which is alluring and therefore uh, expansive of their influence and power in their local immediate contexts. So all trust is local. It's kind of like Brian McClanahan says on his channel. think locally, act locally. Um, we really have no amount of agency within the broader macro context of our politics of how our global empire or other empires in the world may operate. But we do have control of how we conceive of ourselves, uh, and we can choose to live out Republican virtues even when we are in effect, and in fact, subjects of an empire. We can conduct ourselves as citizens of a republic. We can build frameworks for the cultivation, the continuation, the preservation, the protection of Republican virtues, and the maintenance of real power and something of a societal veto in our local contexts. Be that a family compound, be that a municipality which organizes and articulates itself in a way that allows it to develop a distinct identity, to have some real control over its immediate resources, and to use them for the greatest good of its own population. Um, Obviously, there are a lot of legal constraints to these things, but essentially, what I'm trying to say is that the South is becoming the new engine of the American empire. We are going to be culturally depleted as a consequence of this. We're going to be faced with even greater degrees of demographic uh, mixing as a consequence of this, by which I mean the South is going to become less Southern in fact and in culture. In effect, um, we're going to be tempted with opportunities, with prosperity, with all the things that come with empire. But if we accept this bargain, uh, the South will be less than a ruin uh, after the fact. Our history will be written over and erased. Um, our people will be permanently destroyed, and there will be no South to speak of. So the only way that the South continues is if we choose individually and in our family and friend networks, in our networks of acquaintances, etc., in our churches, at the municipal level, at the county level, to conceive of ourselves as Southerners, to lean into that identity and to endeavor to further it and define it uh, in real terms, not just in a wholly ambiguous fashion. What does it mean to be a Southerner, and how do we bring forth Southern identity and the Southern tradition and apply it in our 21st century context? Because if we do not do that, then the South will just be an antiquarian interest. It will not be a real people in a real place anymore. It will just be a nation which once was and is no longer. And I would not have that happen. So we have to choose to continue to conduct ourselves as Republican citizens. We have to choose to be as self-reliant, as locally reliant, as family reliant, as community reliant within our churches, etc., as possible. And we have to do what Southerners have long done well and assist each other rather than allowing ourselves and our neighbors to rely upon the faceless and impersonal systems that are the body of this empire in which we live. And it is tempting, certainly, to just go ahead and give in and lean on those structures which are in place. But in so doing, you lose the competency and the virtues and the habits of soul, which will ultimately form the foundation of whatever is to come after the fall of this empire. So I'm certainly hopeful that we will see some islands of virtue in some organized communities of virtue uh, remain in existence in the South and in the United States more broadly. But we're the ones who are presently in the fire. We're the ones who are now being put to the test. And I hope that we will not fail that test as all or most other regions of the United States have done when it has been their turn to profit from empire. One other thing I did want to mention is Europe. Obviously, they are part of our empire, but there are a couple of interesting aspects of the European situation at the present moment that I thought it worthwhile to mention. Um, One of these is that with regard to, for instance, welfare programs, the Europeans in general, especially the Western Europeans, they very much conduct themselves as subjects of empires. And this has long been a dig that American conservatives especially have leveled at them as like, well, you don't have any right to bear arms. You essentially have no sovereignty in your day-to-day individual lives. Therefore, you are subjects and not citizens. We are subjects as well. Now, we don't have nearly so much power as we perceive ourselves to possess with regard to uh, the societal veto, so to speak. We've allowed the muscles that would permit us real independence to atrophy over the course of generations. And there's desperate need to reclaim and exercise those. But Europeans, even though they are actually on the peripheries of the American empire, they still conceive of themselves to be the chief subjects of their own individual empires, be it France, be it Britain, be it Germany, be it Scandinavian countries, etc. They essentially have this belief that as the subjects of these erstwhile glorious empires, they are owed uh, these comfortable welfare programs and just prosperity and ease and leisure, um, even though they are not ultimately particularly significant in the context of the American empire. They have a sense of entitlement that comes from having once possessed their own empires, and they're very far from the Republican self-conception that America has possessed much more recently, and I would say to some extent still does possess, even though it is misplaced. Um, all of the muscles that they would need to exercise in order to uh, operate in a self-governing capacity are gone. In most European countries, it is not even legal to homeschool one's own children. Um, Obviously, almost no Western European country has anything akin to a right to bear arms, a right to self-defense. Um, and obviously, their speech laws, their laws uh, restricting Christian worship and Christian identity and local organization, etc., are just many times worse than what we see even in very leftist American states. But there's also this idea of the statesman, and I think that this is fundamental to republics. Um, Obviously, there are many great statesmen in early American history, especially from George Washington to James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, Monroe, even. A lot of the early presidents, even Theodore Roosevelt, I would say, was a statesman, but they've gotten rarer and rarer as time has gone on, because a statesman is a character who features prominently in a republic, not in an empire. And we have been an empire for a very long time. One thing that I was thinking about with regard to this is that in Europe, well, take Britain, for example. Obviously, their political situation is distinct from continental Europe, but it's in this way fairly similar to a number of Western European countries. Whereas in the United States, we vote for individual politicians who, some may lay claim to the title of statesman, but very few. But in essence, we have a statesman-based model of government. We elect individuals who we believe to be possessed of principles which are in accordance with our own, and to whose judgment we defer in large part when we put them in those offices to exercise power in the event of exigency and emergency, unforeseen situations. In Europe, for instance, in Britain, they do not elect individual statesmen at all. They elect a party within a given constituency, and that party chooses which individual will represent it in that seat, be it a regular parliament seat or be it the prime minister. Um, all of their offices are one step further removed from the people than are offices within the United States. This is not a statesmanship model at all. This is really an imperial model. This is a systematized approach to government which is lost any personal, any relational aspect. And we should count ourselves certainly blessed to still have so Republican a form of government as we do have, even though it has been vastly altered by our long history as an empire ever since 1865. So that was just one observation that I felt it was worthwhile to add to this. But in general, those are my thoughts on the subject. I'm sorry not to have given any quotes from Southern statesmen in this context, but uh, I didn't want to allow all of these ideas that I've been kicking around to evaporate in the process of endeavoring to substantiate my claims with the words of wiser men. But I do hope that you nonetheless found some cause for thought in what I had to say, and I would love to hear your own thoughts on these subjects and uh, where you think the American nation finds itself now, or nations find themselves now. I do believe the South to be a distinct people, although less and less so with time, but that's beside the point. Where do we find ourselves now in the course of empire? And do you think that we are a late stage empire? Do you think that we are that we have a prospect of a golden age? Do you think that we have a prospect of returning to uh, a Republican point in our development? Could we actually, as the United States, become a Republican polity again? Or are we inevitably and inescapably an empire? Um, and will something new have to come forth, which will not be the United States, if we are ever to have the prospect of living as genuine, unqualified citizens of a republic rather than subjects of an empire? Um, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and thank you for the time, and God bless. Stay Indies.